It's wonderful to be here to address this very important topic today, ageing in culture, because, as we just heard, it's a wonderful time to be discussing ageing, because the contradictions around it are so very stark and increasing all the time, although I'll only have time to address a few of them here. Obviously, we're all aging from the day we're born. Just the passing of time can be a bit melancholy as we look back on yesterday. But what I'll be addressing is old age, and I think from my audience there's quite an interest in that today. But this brings us to the very first paradox, is that we hear that nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to think about it. Old age, perish the thought. But you don't look old. That's what I hear. Of course, I like to hear it, so why am I writing a book on aging? But behind that, behind you don't look old, don't mention old age, everywhere people are secretly thinking about it, or perhaps nowadays not quite so secretly, and worrying about it from an ever younger age. So aging has, in fact, become one of the key topics of the moment. Yes, it's up there. If only because at the close of the last century, there's been a constant hum of alarm being sounded that we're facing a demographic time bomb. Grey dawn, the global crisis of aging, was how the US investment banker, doubling as a social commentator, as so many of them do nowadays, Peter Peterson in 1999, summed up what he claimed was the very greatest hazard facing the developed world in the 21st century. Indeed, his rhetoric became apocalyptic as he drew to his close. Global aging could trigger a crisis that engulfs the world economy. This crisis may even threaten democracy itself. Well, corporate capital knows all about threatening democracy, but that's another matter. Such rhetoric helps explain what at first seems paradoxical, that we're nearly all living longer, indeed, on average, a whole generation longer than we did a century ago, yet this seems to have done nothing to shift the general cultural antipathy towards old age. If anything, the opposite. In Britain, 10 million people are currently over 65 years old, around a sixth of the population, and it's thought that that will double over the next few decades. Today, there are already more people over 65 than under 16. However, instead of this making us feel a lot stronger, where there's a lot of us around, it's precisely these facts that have been used by many to fan fears about the growing numbers of old people. In actuality, just a few commentators, such as the astute writer Yvonne Roberts, points out that older people may provide quite as much care as they receive, with older partners, friends and neighbours often looking after each other, as well as providing significant amounts of childcare for grandchildren, and they're often very active in the voluntary sector. Indeed, the voluntary sector relies upon their contribution. But all this is somehow set aside, doing little to offset this talk of rising alarm over this greying population. Tellingly, in his parting statement to the House of Lords, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, another astute observer, suggested that negative stereotypes of the ageing population are fostering attitudes of contempt and leaving them vulnerable to physical abuse. Actually, last time I gave a similar talk, somebody from Age Concern was in the audience, and she said, "I'm just waiting for the first person to be killed on the streets." And I thought, oh dear, I haven't actually got as paranoid as that about it, but some people are quite worried. Indeed, there is thus aversion towards the very topic of aging, as I discovered when I wrote the book Out of Time. It took me a year to get it published, and all my previous publishers, who'd done fairly well out of my other books, didn't want to publish it. They said, no, people aren't interested in old age. Anne Karp, with her book How to Age, also found the same thing. It took her 10 years for her thoughts on old age to get to press. And of course, Simone de Beauvoir had found exactly the same thing over 40 years ago when she wrote her book called in English The Coming of Age because nobody would buy a book called by the title it had in French, Old Age. So, you know, people are just worried about mentioning this word, old. Yet, even if many people may be wanting to avoid the topic, the issue of aging will not go away. One might say that a new spectre is haunting us, the threatening tsunami of old people, and that's what a graphic of the tsunami of old people there. This image comes from the words of one of our best-known novelists, though recently decamped to New York, Martin Amis, and he is feeding fears of a cultural and economic crisis, as we heard before, being caused by this ominous silver tsunami of old people. In his words, there'll be a population of demented, very old people stinking up the streets. Okay, this once leftish writer was perhaps merely reverting to kind, becoming in old age more like his conservative father, Kingsley, a type of peevish provocateur on the lookout for publicity for books that are now not quite as acclaimed as he would like them to be. Though Kingsley was a bit kinder on old people, and indeed he won the Booker Prize, which his son hasn't yet managed to, for his book on old age called The Old Devils, where actually he's rather kinder about them. And others are less savage than Martin Amis, not calling for suicide booths for the elderly on street corners, as Amis does, which, by the way, is a very hackneyed idea. Some of you may know that in 1882, Anthony Trollope played around with this idea, writing a satirical dystopian novel on the theme called The Fixed Period, imagining a future society set in 1980, so he didn't get it so wrong, in which euthanasia would become compulsory between 67 and 68. So its hero is very much involved in public works, and he's approaching this age and, suicide time. But no, this is not the general call today. Nevertheless, in other ways, there has been a public orchestration of hostility towards the aging population, and especially towards my own generation, the so-called baby boomers born at the end of the Second World War, now entering old age. Of course, it neatly combines two favourite conservative mantras, trashing the legacy of the 1960s and what we had fought for then, while also denigrating those seen as potentially unproductive in need of welfare support, supposedly having accrued excellent state pensions, though of course many of us, as I'll say again in a minute, have not, especially women have not. Interestingly, in the culturally hegemonic USA, new forms of ageism emerged most strongly in the 1990s. Not coincidentally, the big thrust against welfare was taking place then, and it was then that the eminent cultural historian and gerontologist Thomas Cole warned that the extent of the federal budget deficit in the USA was creating an increase, because of all their wars, obviously, not because of their old people, creating an increasing possibility of intergenerational warfare between young and old. In his now classic text, The Journey of Life, A Cultural History of Aging in America. What he did not mention was the extent of the media's role in inciting such warfare. His compatriot, the incisive scholar of aging and cultural critic, Margaret Goulet, whom some of you probably have heard of, was meanwhile busy compiling an extensive register of the many ways in which the popular media were actively manufacturing a form of homogenized generational combat throughout the 1990s in the USA, mocking the greedy baby boomers, those approaching retirement, supposedly responsible for impoverishing those in their wake. Cry baby boomers, hate their kids, was one typical front page headline. Some declared that this boomer bashing had indeed become a national pastime. And that's the interesting thing about ageism in our societies, is those as though those who are young or entering middle age aren't themselves incredibly quickly going to be the old. You know, there's us and them. Well, no, that isn't, you know, and somewhere deep down they know we're about to be them, but it's as though it's their fault, it's the old people's fault that we're going to become old ourselves. In the UK, the most vicious of the media attacks on the 60-plus generation occurred a little later, especially, again not coincidentally, following the fiscal crisis of 2008, when the British media joined the chorus of denunciation of those typecast as baby boomers. So on the BBC, I remember one of their front page headlines in 2008, "Crisis. Blame the baby boomers, not the bankers." What a good idea, was the headline in the Times. I think that was February 2010, introducing an article by the paper's principal economic columnist, Anatol Kaletsky. Kaletsky ended his analysis of the current economic crisis with a warning of the huge dangers of the rapid escalating, I think I have another one here, yes, of the rapid escalating cost of government finance, pensions and healthcare as the baby boom generation born from 1945 onwards enter retirement. The very idea that an entire population of the new elderly could be declared selfish might seem obviously dim-witted, but it was the argument propounded by no less than the Conservative Cabinet Minister, sometimes known as Two Brains. I think of him more as No Brains, but he's called David Willetts, who put all his authority behind the attacks on my generation in his book published February 2010 entitled The Pinch. Yes, you know what's coming. How baby boomers took their children's future and why they should give it back. Ignoring altogether the role of reckless fiscal gambling following the deregulation of the banking sector, as well as the gigantic accumulation of personal bonuses in that sector, still happening today, of course, Willetts instead blamed the current crisis on the self-interest and electoral dominance of the huge generation of baby boomers, as summed up in his provocative subtitle. Willetts' view, obviously echoed by Kaletsky, is that the only way to avoid permanent crisis in Britain, it's nothing to do with regulating the banks, forget that, it would be to take drastic measures to reduce the pension and health costs of the generation now entering their 60s. Other manifestos quickly appeared with the same noxious message. Again, on BBC websites, the journalist Neil Borman published his own polemical manifesto inciting generational blame. It's all their fault. Seemingly a call to arms for the young to line up against the older generation. In fact, they do have something called the generation game, I believe, in America, where they pit the young against the old, but I don't know much about that. The young are all now living in the shadow of the baby boomer generation. Others across the political spectrum soon followed, with erstwhile Labour Party figures such as Francis Beckett launching his own very similar critique. What did the baby boomers ever do for us? With its now familiar subtitle, How Children of the 60s Lived the Dream and Failed the Future. The chorus is now so familiar, with even the authoritative voice of Will Hutton from the left joining this, mea culpa, guilty as charged. Yes, I am very overpaid. So we need to row back. Not all boomers have shared Hutton's luck. We're not all heading up colleges at Oxford. Although the numbers of pensioners living in low-income families have fallen slightly in recent years, it's still the case that over 20% of those who live in poverty and extreme poverty are pensioners, rising to 30% if they're single women, with at least a third of that group being women in their 60s. It's important to note that some boomers have had no good fortune to feel guilty about, remaining instead often vulnerable, sometimes isolated, often isolated, as in the news today, and with meagre pension entitlements. This may be for reasons of class, ethnicity, disability, ill health, or other circumstances, but indeed, amongst my own close acquaintances, hard times have often come precisely because they refuse to buy into the lures of professionalism and the corporate world. instead busy trying to keep out people like David Willits. Selfish, greedy? I think not. We should not need the assistance of Pat Thane, that meticulous researcher of old age in British history, to direct us to the residual poverty of my generation. Writing a few years ago, Thane indicated that for many women, the difficulties of providing for their old age, at least a third of women, have been known for over a century, have changed very little, and have not gone away. Our pension system has been characterized by a state pension too low to live on comfortably, and dependence on occupation and private pensions which cannot provide a comfortable old age to the low-paid and irregularly employed, most of them women. Not all of them, but most of them. A report from the Nuffield Foundation, just published as I write, highlights the latest scandal that the slashing of council welfare budgets in recent years leaves 250,000 elderly people without state-funded help for their basic care, including bathing, dressing, and eating. Now, interestingly, the very latest budget from the Tories in coalition now is likely to incite even more animosity towards the elderly, with headlines telling us, even in My Guardian, blues have turned grey. Well, one could say, metaphorically, yes, they are turning grey, but only for those with a lot of silver in their pockets, as well as in what remains of their locks. Yes, there is now help for older people with savings, a lot of savings, given the expansion of the amount that can be invested in tax-free ISAs, as well as more freedom over how the elderly can spend the pension money they have accrued. So shockingly to me, it's precisely all the low-paid and irregularly employed older people who will receive no benefit at all from these changes. In fact, they're self-servingly targeting those with money to get the money circulating so that they can make more profit from it. Those with sufficient spare funds to be making significant investments. Indeed, as economist Nick Pearce from the Institute of Public Policy Research indicates, you'd need to be earning around $125,000 a year. Most people aren't earning that, but you'd need to be earning that to make the most of the Chancellor's new $15,000 a year limit on ISAs for elderly people. At a time of growing poverty and further austerity cuts, he concludes, with presumably ironic understatement, these are hardly the people who should be the priority of additional tax benefits. Think about it. At a time, this government's repetitive mantra of helping the hard-working is a not-so-hidden code for suggesting that those for whom, for whatever reason, are outside the workplace or who have not already accrued significant funds are undeserving of help. It thus continues the attack on people's entitlements to welfare at all ages, which has been the whole thrust of neoliberal rhetoric for the last few decades, turning the better off against those less well off than themselves. The deep disdain towards the poor is captured in the humour of our London Lord Mayor, Boris Johnson, joking a few weeks ago that if foolish old folk spent their pension pot too early as a result of the latest government reforms, allowing them to do so, it would be their own fault. They'll have to survive living in rusting Lamborghinis and eating tins of dog food. What a laugh. Should he become an MP? Well, we shall see. For certain, as some of you will know only too well, many of the younger generation are indeed suffering from the ongoing economic recession today. However, to blame that older generation for the effects of policies many of us comprehensively opposed is not only spurious, but it is used to foreclose any useful analysis of the present. It's the growing inequality within, not between, different age cohorts that's a significant outcome of current economic and social crisis. Many leading economists have been making this point for years, the economists Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman simply being amongst the better known. So I think we can agree that this is far from an easy climate to try to turn around those enduring cultural fears and phobias which are likely to be around, which we know can surround old age, with much of the world at large so eager to pit the young against the old, inciting that sort of generational tension. And meanwhile, the iconic figures of old age have always been negative. The cultural figures of old age have always been negative. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot about this later. Think of those road signs that the Age Concern has always complained about, of two figures doubled up over their walking stick, frail and anxious. Beware, elderly people about, it seems to say. It's hard to shake the enduring image of aging as a process of seamless decline. In fact, that great writer, Penelope Lively, who in all her books often is writing about aging, talks about going into a school and getting school children to write about old people, and she said they all gave these unbelievably negative pictures of failed old wizened people, and she said, isn't it strange? Most of them probably have grandmothers who are either still working or else doing a lot of care work and very active, but nevertheless they have this image of what it is to be old that is completely different. And this remains the case even though we've recently heard more talk of aging well, endorsed by government sources, and certainly the marketing of cosmetics and other solutions to keep the signs of old age at bay. Yes, we can stay forever young. You don't really have to get old. As some have noticed, the problem here is that the rhetoric of aging well tends to double as a possibility that we won't really age, or we won't show too many signs of being old, but instead we'll somehow manage to stay young with a little help from the burgeoning pharmaceutical, cosmetic or surgical industries. Adding to the classic fears of old age is the fact that there's always been a significant double standard when it comes to cultural attitudes towards aging. Fears of aging are fed almost from birth by terrifying images in myth and folk tale, which is what those children in school would be responding to. The hag, the harridan, the witch or Medusa. However, such frightening figures are not incidentally female. You might notice the hag, the witch, the harridan, the old bag. They are quintessentially female, seen as monstrous because of the combination of age and gender. Oh my God, I'm only halfway through. Think of the famous Dutch painting there, The Ugly Duchess, also known as a grotesque old woman, a satirical portrait painted by the Flemish artist Quentin Matisse. No equivalent symbolic images trail through time, attaching to men. And indeed, as Susan Sontag said 40 years ago, the double standard of aging means that women are aged by culture far faster than men. Actually, many people have said this. Discarded sooner, both in the public world and increasingly the private world as well. The fact that women are aged by culture faster than men, I didn't start till 20 past though, so I haven't been going that long. You take them into account. The aged by culture faster than men, as well as confined to so many fewer jobs in the labour market, often taking time out of work for childcare and so on, does have lasting implications, especially for older women. And indeed recently, the Commission on Older Women, begun by the Labour Party, chaired by Harriet Harman, found that of those who have lost their jobs over the last few years since the austerity cuts, 41% of them have been older women between 50 and 64. I think I've got something on that too. As well as this report points out that 82% of broadcast presenters aged 50 or over are men. So women are simply disappearing from public spaces far, far earlier than men, which has very significant repercussions for their dependency and poverty in later years. Nevertheless, if older women are especially at risk from ageism in our culture, the fears and disparagement of old age, now strengthened by demographic panics, do affect us all. And one of the first ways in which I think it affects us is to encourage that disavowal and denial, the thought that I'm not old. Someone else my age may be old, but I myself don't feel old. And that's exactly what in the archives you'll find with interviews with older people, they tend to say. So, for instance, Paul Thompson, the oral historian, when he interviewed many people some years ago, they all echoed this thought, and that was the title of his book, I Don't Feel Old. The oral histories collected by the writer Roland Blythe found this very same thing. One 84-year-old reflects, I tend to look upon other older men as old and not include myself. My boyhood stands forever before me, and that's still the sort of person I think I am. How can a 17-year-old like me suddenly be 81? The exactingly scientific developmental biologist Lewis Walpole wrote in his ironically entitled book, You're Looking Very Well, which is what you say to old people. I mean, you don't look old. A recent Pew survey in the USA found that at 50, people tended to say they felt at least 10 years younger. At 60, a significant number said that they felt 20 years younger. So I think this tells us something about the way in which those negative images of old age stick. And also, it tells us also something about the way they're seen as frail, the way they're seen as feminine. And in my book, I say a lot about the fact that men too have extreme fears of aging, and you see that in a lot of novels, not just Martin Amis and Philip Roth, in many other well-known novels who write about old age. And for them, it's this sense of phallic failure, the huge consumption of Viagra and so on, testifying to that, and the fear that somehow they're going to be feminized. And that's what Bill Murray, a professor of law in the USA, wrote about in his book, Losing It. This sense that we'll no longer be proper men. We'll no longer be proper men. What aging does, Murray says, is turn men into women, or at least it neuters them. So that's one reason, I think, for the disavowal around aging and the difficulty with affirming old age. There's also something which in the book I refer to as temporal vertigo, in which it is true that while we age every day, we're aged by culture, usually in rather negative and poisonous ways, but also we do have those threads through time that keep us attached to those younger selves we've been. We only have to fall asleep to imagine ourselves younger, to have a sense of what we were when we were young. Interestingly, when we look back, we usually nostalgically think how beautiful and energetic and happy we must have been with all our young friends when we look at old photos. Often we were rather sad and distressed, in fact, but nevertheless we imagine post hoc that everything must have been fine when we were young, and that's what I have Virginia Woolf saying, sometimes I feel I'm 40, I feel I'm the youngest person on the bus, sometimes I feel 250 years old, she says at 49, the year before she in fact commits suicide. And at 73, Doris Lessing, again with a certain exaggeration, but not something completely untrue, says the real secret is that old people share is that you really haven't changed in 70 or 80 years. Your body changes, but you don't change at all. And that, of course, causes great confusion. Simone de Beauvoir says something very similar in her book, and I try and examine that, what it is to feel all ages and no age as well as old. How to, do that time traveling, or to understand the time traveling that we do as we get older. So if I have to stop, I can. What I haven't had time to go on to in my last 3 pages was what I wrote about affirming old age. Well, it's okay, I'll just talk. And, yes, well, there's someone that took affirming old age, do something outrageous every day, and stand before people you fear and speak your mind, even if your voice shakes. And Maggie Coons, as again some of you might know, started the Grey Panther movement, I don't think it was a party, in 1970, when at 65 she was retired from her job. She worked for the Presbyterian Church, and she started this movement in order, as she said, to combat the negative stereotypes about old age, but also to bridge the generational gaps. And she lived in a big house, and she always had people of different ages living with her. She even dared to have relationships with younger men. In the book, I talk a lot about the life of desire and how much easier it becomes in the straight world for older men. The older they get, it seems almost, to have younger partners, and the more and more difficult it gets for women from middle age to couple up with a man if that's what they want to do. But again, that's something I talk about in the book. And so what I'm explaining in affirming aging is what's significant is that you do, if you're lucky, come to understand something about what it is to be human, and you come to realize that what it is to be human is actually to be aware that a lot of life is tragic as well as joyful, and that you'll always have losses. You're always losing things. But with loss and the mourning of losses, and particularly the loss of loved people and loved friends, you are also able to dwell on that and internalize that. And I do have a section on the work of mourning, for instance, in which I read a lot of those mourning memoirs that people have written, in which it becomes clear, as actually Freud describes in Mourning and Melancholia, that the terrible grief you feel with loss if you have loved and dependent upon another person, or indeed other friends, or sometimes causes and other things that have been important to you. You need to reflect. You'll be taking in the first year or so everything about them if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, you'll actually have internalized your anger with them for dying, and the melancholia is attacking yourself for being worthless, which is actually also a way of criticizing those people who've abandoned you. But other people find ways of feeling, yes, that person is dead, but, their memory, their thoughts, they're still with us, and they're still with me. And also, how wonderful for us to think that there are other people in the world for whom we will remain important to them. So being able to embrace loss and talk about loss and to mourn, but also being able to live in the moment, in the pleasures of the moment. If you think of our culture, it's always forward-looking. We must always be thinking about the future, But as many of the people who've been most influential on me, like Adrian Rich or Grace Paley or other people, have written about the significance of thinking about our own past, thinking about the past more generally, and thinking about the present and the past in terms of living in the present and being able to cherish what it is to live in the present, to remain attached to life and affirming of life in, as I say, both its pains and its perils. It's being able to, and its pleasures, it's being able to feel anything strongly, it seems to me, that is what keeps us attached to life. And at any age, a lot of people, particularly if they're in jobs working, all the hours they have to work in work they don't have to do, being able to feel strongly about what they're doing, about the world, can be quite difficult. And I think the older we are, the more it becomes, if we're lucky, easier to cherish the moment. And also, hopefully, if we're also lucky, to stay in touch with older, younger, to try and build those generational bridges, which are going to be important for us as older people, but not only for us, because, of course, you age incredibly fast. And the older you get, the faster you age. There are reasons for that, which I don't have time to go into now. And so, we need to be able to think, yes, it is possible to enjoy old age. We have to find ways of representing that. And some people working in art, writing in literature, are trying to think about that. For people like me, who's always been involved in politics, then it's also, remaining the radical skeptic that I've always been, that Adrian Rich talks about. We can become older sages, radical skeptics, still saying what we think is wrong with the world as well as what was wrong with the ways in which we perhaps were trying to change it, but nevertheless speaking out and speaking up, as Maggie Kuhn suggests. So I'll end there.
questions. Any member of the panel? There will be two people assisting with roving mics. I see a person there. If you raise your hand, I'll just... yeah, and then there's somebody behind this lady there.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. 3 questions. I'll try to be brief, although it might take you all day to answer them. The first is, as a well-known writer on the political economy of feminism, do you think that there is now a job to be done on the political economy of older people's unpaid labour, particularly the kind of childcare which is contributed by grandparents, which accounts for about 1 in 4 of kids in daycare in Britain?
Yes.
Secondly, I wonder what the British Library can do about another issue, which is that in more traditional societies, older people are respected for their wisdom, this being basically the age before written and digital materials became the means of storing and passing information from one generation to another. So that oral history becomes extremely important, I think, in order to gain respect for age. And thirdly, I think we're not greedy and all the other things that some people have levelled at us, but we are incredibly lucky insofar as we had free education on the welfare state, and we had cheap housing at the time when London house prices in particular were very low. What can we do to ensure that those gains are fairly taxed and that we give our due to the younger generation? Thank you.
Do you want to take another couple and then I'll reply?
Yes, it's Robert's lady.
I would echo my thanks for your very positive approach to ageing, but I would like to ask you whether you wouldn't agree that you have really rather omitted something crucial, and that is the decline of one's health towards the end of the baby boom years and the oncoming older age, if you like. And that deterioration, I think, should be in people's minds to prepare for in the future. Thank you.
Shall I? Okay. Well, yes, it's absolutely crucial to think about the amount of unpaid care which older people, particularly grandparents, are doing. And sometimes it's rather tricky because they can lose contact with their grandchildren after putting a lot of care into it if there are divorces or people move away and so on. So, and jobs are relying on it in keeping people at work for ever longer hours. What feminists fought for was a shorter working day, and instead we've got almost a double working day for both many women and men in the workforce. So that is a crucial thing to think about. And it does relate to the question about older people's health and particularly declining cognitive health, which tends to set in more in the 90s. Even going into our late 90s, the majority of us will not be suffering from serious cognitive dementia, but a very significant minority of us will be. And so we will be in need of care. That care is often supplied by other older, late middle-aged relatives by then, but not everybody will have those late middle-aged relatives. And what about caring jobs? What's wrong with caring jobs and paying people to care for those in need of care? We're not really a poor society, you know. We're not really. Of course we could not simply be importing women from the third world and paying them next to nothing to take up the care work which our society needs. We could be creating more decent jobs for that to be done, and that could be done. And there are many economists, for instance, I didn't get, it was something that I was going on to in my paper to talk about that in terms of that silver tsunami and the pension crisis we're all facing. Other people have pointed out, for instance, Phil Merlin, and most recently I was looking at another report from some Scottish ageing researchers saying that this crisis is overstated because although we're living longer, we're also living healthier. We are living healthier. You know, there's a lot of emphasis on how to live well, and not everybody is in need of huge amounts of care, and the amounts of care we need are those which provide the resources to allow people to be able to be living in their homes or in certain sheltered housing where they where they have more independence, that will enable them to do more care for themselves rather than to be in need of that total care in homes. So thinking about how to care for people with serious fragility, with serious cognitive deterioration is what we need to be doing, not just thinking of that magic bullet that's going to prevent Alzheimer's. And there is another thing. We don't like to think about dementia at all, but it's not the case that it's impossible for people, even with serious cognitive dementia, to be giving back something for those to those who are caring for them. What I also say in my book is that we need to think again about dependency and interdependence and the fact that we're always interdependent. And when we're caring for someone, just as when we were caring for children, when we're caring for old people, we're not just giving out and getting nothing back. There's a relationship there. And it's often the case, even when we're doing a lot of care for people who need a great deal of attention, you'll find when that person does die, the enormous loss of no longer having someone to care for. And a lot of old people, their problem is that they have no one left to care for. That actually, to be able to care for people is an essential human need, it seems to me, to both be able to receive care and to give care. And that's something from birth. We are always interdependent. My Department of Psychosocial Studies, that's where we begin from. We only ever know who we are through our relations to other people. And it's those relations to other people that have to be maintained, not just the way in which we think about the market economy with the market in charge of everything, as though relations between people and that give and take of dependency is not important. In terms of other societies that used to look after their elderly in better ways, certainly other societies have looked after their elderly in different ways. The first thing to say about that, when Hunt says, oh, well, my wife is Chinese, they have no problem in China because they all look after their elderly there. Well, actually, they don't. Actually, they've just introduced a law there to say that children will be jailed if they don't look after their elderly parents, because in fact they can't quite often, because they're not living anywhere near them, and they're only allowed to have one child anyway, so that they can't really be relying on that. And in those societies where apparently the elderly respected are usually societies where people did not live so long, and therefore there were fewer older people, and those older people that were there tended to be richer and more powerful, and so that's one reason that you can't simply make comparisons between different societies and how they've cared for the elderly, and we need to think again about how we're going to do it. And of course we're the lucky generation, and we're the lucky generation partly as well because we fought for a lot of the benefits that we have. We also started to lose those benefits when, what we gained, the right had a campaign to roll back those gains which we had made. And we have to simply try and keep fighting to maintain them, it seems to me. Okay.